The sticky, crunchy, greasy world of medieval snacks. You are walking through the winding lanes of a medieval town. Maybe it's York, maybe Rouen, or perhaps a dusty corner of Naples where the wind always smells faintly of olives and smoke. But you're not here for the architecture or the gossip of guildsmen. You're hungry. Not for roasted goose or a trench of pottage. No. You're craving something quick, cheap, and completely lacking in nutrition. Something fried, sticky, or barely legal under the rules of fasting days. You want junk food. And to your surprise, in the Middle Ages, there was plenty of it. The term junk food didn't exist, of course, but the craving did. People in medieval Europe, just like us, were constantly snacking between meals, especially in cities, where food stalls dotted the streets like modern fast food chains. These weren't just places to fill one's stomach, they were embedded in the social and economic life of towns. Monks complained about them. City councils tried to regulate them, and peasants, craftsmen, and apprentices swarmed to them with coin in hand. One of the most common medieval street snacks was the humble fritter, what we might now call a donut's distant cousin. Flour, egg, and water formed a thick batter that could be mixed with apples, herbs, or bits of fish, then fried in animal fat until golden. These fritters were cheap and filling, and because they were cooked in oil, they bypassed certain restrictions on fasting days. Technically, vendors sold them hot from roadside cauldrons, and the smell alone was enough to draw crowds of hungry workers. Crisp on the outside, soft inside, and often served sprinkled with honey or sugar if you could afford it. These fritters were the very definition of addictive if you lived near the coast or river. Another popular treat was dried or fried fish, especially eels. Eels were abundant, easy to catch, and considered acceptable even on fasting days. Poor families might stew them, but street vendors preferred to fry them whole and sell them wrapped in paper or rough cloth. Bones and all, children gnawed at them like meat lollipops. In some cities, like London, eel pies were so common that entire neighborhoods were named after them. Pie Corner still exists to this day. Then there were sweet things. Sugar was wildly expensive, but honey was everywhere. Bees were kept in monastery gardens, cottage yards, and even urban rooftops. A common sweet snack was candied nuts, boiled in honey and left to cool in sticky clumps. Ginger and cinnamon, if available, were ground into the mix for special occasions. For wealthier townsfolk, pastries filled with dates, figs, or sweetened cheese were sold by bakers who specialized only in subtleties, a word that meant decorative and often sugary dishes, meant to impress guests more than nourish them. But even the lower classes found ways to indulge. Bread crusts soaked in wine or ale and sprinkled with crushed herbs or berries were a treat for children. Roasted chickpeas, flavored with vinegar or salt, were sold in paper cones by traveling sellers. And let's not forget cheese. Hard, salty cheeses like the kind made by Cistercian monks were cheap, long-lasting, and delicious when pan-fried on a hot iron plate until the edges crisp. Every town had its own take on fast food. In Italy, especially in Naples and Palermo, fried dough filled with cheese and garlic or anchovies was a popular street snack, something not far removed from a primitive calzone. In Paris, roasted chestnuts and grilled meats on skewers were sold outside churches and marketplaces. Even in colder climates like Scandinavia, thin flatbreads were smeared with butter or lard and sprinkled with onions or herbs, then rolled and eaten on the go. Snacking was not just for the poor. In fact, some of the most elaborate snack traditions were found in noble households. Between meals, which could stretch for hours, servants offered little bites on platters, candied flower petals, marzipan animals, salted nuts, or toasted bread rubbed with garlic and topped with mashed peas. These weren't meals, they were status symbols. Yet this abundance of quick food worried many moralists. Medieval clergy often railed against gluttony, not just in the form of overeating, but in the act of eating casually, unceremoniously, and especially between meals. Snacking was seen as a kind of moral weakness if you couldn't wait until dinner. What did that say about your soul? Cities tried to regulate street food. Vendors were fined for reusing frying oil, for making food too close to open drains, or for shouting their wares too loudly near churches. Yet despite these restrictions, snack culture flourished. People were busy, laborers needed energy, children needed distractions, and everyone, noble or peasant, enjoyed the little thrill of grabbing a hot fritter from a greasy vendor before walking back to their chores. Interestingly, the concept of junk food was tied less to the food's healthiness and more to its context. Food that was cheap, fast, or eaten without reverence was seen as morally suspicious. But nutrition, that wasn't really a factor. People didn't think in terms of calories or balanced diets. If it was hot, tasty, and affordable, that was enough. The tools used to make this food were surprisingly modern: portable grills, hot stones, and even early deep frying pans shaped like modern skillets. Vendors often carried their entire kitchens with them slung over their backs or rolled on carts. Some had brass bells to announce their arrival, others relied on smell. And what a smell! It must have been charred onions, burning animal fat, sweetened dough, and the pungent funk of goat cheese and garlic. So the next time you bite into a bag of chips or grab a midnight snack, remember, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. Even in a world without electricity, packaging, or refrigeration, humans always found a way to indulge their cravings for salty, sweet, greasy, or crunchy treats. But here's the curious thing: why, despite all these options, do we know so little about medieval junk food? Cookbooks of the time focused on banquet meals. Chroniclers wrote about politics and kings, not fritters and eels. What did people really eat when no one was watching? And how much of our own snack culture is rooted in these forgotten foods? Now that you've gotten a taste figuratively of what medieval people nibbled on between meals, let's walk deeper into the alleys and open-air stalls of a medieval town. The smells are stronger here. More layered, fried onions, vinegar, the acrid bite of wood smoke and meat fat, and that oddly sweet aroma that always seems to come from near the apothecary stalls. You begin to notice something else. 2 rules, strange ones, posted signs, shouted warnings, muttered complaints about guild taxes and curfews. Because in the Middle Ages, even junk food had laws. It turns out that if you were a street vendor in 13th century London or 14th century Florence, you didn't just need a fire and a pan, you needed a license. In many cities, street food was regulated by powerful trade guilds: the Bakers' Guild, the Fishmongers, even the Brotherhood of Pie Makers in some towns. If you dared to fry a fritter or grill a sausage without guild permission, you might be fined or even have your stall destroyed. These guilds didn't exist just to protect their members. They also served as quality control of a sort. Medieval towns were concerned with cleanliness, though not always in ways we'd recognize. Public health inspectors might check the freshness of your fish, or test your frying fat by smell or taste. Stale oil was a common offense, and if someone got sick from your stall, you could be held personally liable. Some cities went so far as to assign public food tasters men employed to test meats, pies, and fried goods sold in marketplaces to ensure no one was being poisoned or sold spoiled scraps. It wasn't just about health, though. It was about moral order. Many towns passed ordinances prohibiting food sales during church hours or holy processions. You weren't supposed to fry onions while a saint's relics were paraded through the street. Meat was forbidden on fasting days, but that didn't stop sellers from disguising forbidden items, grinding up pork and mixing it with lentils or herbs to make it look like something else. This created an entire black market for questionable snacks, especially in regions like Spain or southern France, where fast days and feast days came in rapid succession. Religious reformers took issue with all this snacking. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins. And it wasn't just about how much you ate, it was about how and when. Eating outside of prescribed hours, indulging in foods meant only for the wealthy, or treating eating as pleasure rather than nourishment, all marked you as morally suspect. A fried apple fritter in the hands of a child might seem innocent, but in the sermons of the day, that fritter could symbolize the decay of society. This is especially ironic when you consider how deeply food was tied into religious life. Monasteries often had their own snack-like traditions. During long services, monks were sometimes allowed to suck on hard bread or dried fruit to stay awake. During Lent, special pastries, often bland, but filling, were baked to break the fast with symbolic meaning. The Lenten pretzel, for instance, was a common snack made without eggs or dairy, twisted into the shape of praying arms. It was both spiritual and starchy. Festivals, however, were when medieval junk food truly came alive. Markets and church fairs turned into chaotic celebrations of flavor. Vendors sold pastries filled with fruit or custard, boiled sweets shaped like animals, and even early versions of funnel cake, fried batter poured through a spout into hot oil, sprinkled with sugar or crushed nuts. These were days of indulgence before fasting began again. Think of Shrove Tuesday or carnival celebrations, massive feasts before Lent, where people emptied their pantries into pies and fried as much as they could before 40 days of abstention. Meat, fat, and that oddly sweet aroma that always seems to come from near the apothecary stalls. You begin to notice something else, too. Rules, strange ones, posted signs, shouted warnings, muttered complaints about guild taxes and curfews. Because in the Middle Ages, even junk food had laws. It turns out that if you were a street vendor in 13th century London or 14th century Florence, you didn't just need a fire and a pan, you needed a license. In many cities, street food was regulated by powerful trade guilds, the Bakers' Guild, the Fishmongers, even the Brotherhood of Pie Makers in some towns. If you dared to fry a fritter or grill a sausage without guild permission, you might be fined or even have your stall destroyed. These guilds didn't exist just to protect their members. They also served as quality control of a sort. Medieval towns were concerned with cleanliness, though not always in ways we'd recognize. Public health inspectors might check the freshness of your fish or test your frying fat by smell or taste. Stale oil was a common offense, and if someone got sick from your stall, you could be held personally liable. Some cities went so far as to assign public food tasters men employed to test meats, pies, and fried goods sold in marketplaces to ensure no one was being poisoned or sold spoiled. Scraps. It wasn't just about health, though. It was about moral order. Many towns passed ordinances prohibiting food sales during church hours or holy processions. You weren't supposed to fry onions, while a saint's relics were paraded through the street. Meat was forbidden on fasting days, but that didn't stop sellers from disguising forbidden items, grinding up pork and mixing it with lentils or herbs to make it look like something else. This created an entire black market for questionable snacks, especially in regions like Spain or southern France, where fast days and feast days came in rapid succession. Religious reformers took issue with all this snacking. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and it wasn't just about how much you ate, it was about how and when. Eating outside of prescribed hours, indulging in foods meant only for the wealthy, or treating eating as pleasure rather than nourishment, all marked you as morally suspect. A fried apple fritter in the hands of a child might seem innocent, but in the sermons of the day, that fritter could symbolize the decay of society. This is especially ironic when you consider how deeply food was tied into religious life. Monasteries often had their own snack-like traditions. During long services, monks were sometimes allowed to suck on hard bread or dried fruit to stay awake. During Lent, special pastries, often bland but filling, were baked to break the fast with symbolic meaning. The Lenten pretzel, for instance, was a common snack made without eggs or dairy, twisted into the shape of praying arms. It was both spiritual and starchy. Festivals, however, were when medieval junk food truly came alive. Markets and church fairs turned into chaotic celebrations of flavor. Vendors sold pastries filled with fruit or custard, boiled sweets shaped like animals, and even early versions of funnel cake fried batter poured through a spout into hot oil, sprinkled with sugar or crushed nuts. These were days of indulgence before fasting began again. Think of Shrove Tuesday or carnival celebrations, massive feasts before Lent, where people emptied their pantries into pies and fried as much as they could before 40 days of abstention. In German-speaking regions, honey cakes shaped like saints were sold at fairs and festivals, wrapped in cloth to keep them soft. In England, sugared almonds or dried figs were thrown into crowds during processions, meant both as a blessing and a snack. In Venice and other trade hubs, imported treats like candied citrus peels or sesame seed candies were considered the height of sophistication, often sold at festivals by spice merchants who doubled as confectioners. Then there were the traveling snack sellers, medieval food trucks, if you will. These men and women wandered from town to town, often with carts or baskets, selling roasted nuts, toasted grains, or spiced chickpeas. Some carried small charcoal braziers and cooked their wares fresh in front of customers. They were viewed with suspicion by settled merchants and often targeted by local authorities as disruptors of order, yet they were wildly popular. Their food was cheap, mobile, and most importantly unexpected. A hot meat pie from a passing vendor was a rare and welcome treat. And let's not forget the class distinctions involved. What we call junk food was often the only kind of food accessible to the poor in towns and cities. A piece of bread dipped in ale or fried onions wrapped in a cabbage leaf could be an entire lunch for an apprentice. But to wealthier townsfolk, these same snacks were considered inferior, even dirty. Junk food was literally food from the streets, and the streets, in medieval thinking, were always one wrong step away from sin. Interestingly, snack foods were often the targets of sumptuary laws, not just the clothes people could wear, but the foods they could eat. Certain pastries were reserved for feast days or noble houses. In late medieval England, there were laws restricting how much spice could be used in meat pies for non-nobles, not because the spice was dangerous, but because it was above their station. Imagine being fined for enjoying too much cinnamon in your fritter. This deep entanglement of food, morality, and status shows just how complex even the simplest snack could be. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was identity, order, rebellion, celebration, and faith. Whether you were a peasant buying roasted chickpeas in a paper cone, or a monk nibbling on Lenten pretzels in your cold stone cell, the act of snacking came loaded with meaning. And yet, we know very little about the actual recipes used by street vendors. Few wrote them down. Most were passed orally, adjusted based on what was cheap or in season. What herbs went into the best pan-fried cheese? How did vendors decide which berries to dry, or which cuts of meat could be salvaged for stew? Pies. Were there rivalries among sellers? Was one pieman the talk of York while another's fritters were whispered about in shame? Were left only with traces guild records, tax rolls, a few scattered cookbooks aimed at wealthy households. But the everyday snack culture of medieval towns, that remains mostly invisible. Why was something so common, so universal, so loved, left out of the historical record? And what does it tell us about whose stories were preserved and whose were forgotten? You linger in the market square after sunset, when the wooden shutters bang closed and the last vendor tips a pan of cooling oil into the gutter. A lantern swings from his cart, throwing slices of warm light onto the cobbles while stray dogs nose for scraps. The smells that drew you here all afternoon: fried onion, hot honey, sharp vinegar flattened into a mingled haze. In that hush you begin to sense how fragile these moments are. A fritter is eaten in minutes, a pie in seconds, and the stall that made them can vanish with the next tax hike or bishop's decree. Perhaps that is why the written record is so thin. The life of medieval junk food was designed to disappear. Chroniclers cared for kings and councils, not cooks with grease-scorched fingernails. Monastic scribes feared gluttony and rarely dignified as instruments with ink. What little we know drifts in from the margins of other texts, guild finds, court cases, sermons scolding idle boys lingering about the piemen to fill the silence historians turn to rubbish in York. Layers of black sludge beneath a 14th century tavern revealed clumps of carbonized dough, studded with apple pips. Chemical tests showed trace pork fat rather than beef tallow, hinting that the cook favored the cheaper, smokier lard of backyard hogs. In Lübeck, Germany, a waterfront latrine coughed up peach stones and fragments of almond sugar paste shaped like coins. Luxury litter from a festival night. Archaeology, not parchment, resurrects these snacks crumb by crumb. Yet even trash tells stories of empire. Consider sugar. In early medieval Europe, it was a medicine, doled by apothecaries grain by grain. By the late 1200s, Venetian galleys hauled tons of crystallized cane from Cypriot plantations. Within another century, merchants from Barcelona to Bruges sold secret J-lumps to anyone with a few coins. Honey still sweetened daily porridges, but junk food vendors slipped sugar into fritter batters and fruit pastes. Whenever a wealthy customer hove into view, the appetite they courted reshaped coastlines. Groves were cleared for cane in Sicily, Crete, Madeira, then across the Atlantic on South Home, and eventually Caribbean islands. A bite of candied orange peel at a Paris fair bound peasant taste buds to enslaved African labor. Thousands of miles away, proof that even a trivial pleasure could widen the world. Spice, too, rode the snack trade. Cinnamon curls from Ceylon, gingered Naples from India, peppercorn swept off Javon floors, each might end in a penny tart. Their cost remained high, so vendors stretched flavors by steeping ground spice in vinegar or wine and brushing the liquid over skewered meats. Portable grills invented for this trick spread through Germany, where blacksmiths learned to rivet thin iron sheets into pans light enough for itinerant sellers. The technology trickled upward. Noble kitchens borrowed the shallow skillets to flash fry wafers for banquets, while poorer cooks copied noble waffle irons to brand flatbreads with saints' faces for saints. Days, a feedback loop of hand-to-mouth innovation blurred the lines between street and court, reminding us that technology often travels on the breath of hunger, rather than the command of princes. Were these foods deadly? Medieval skeletons do show worn molars and abscessed jaws, especially in towns where sticky honey cakes outsold earthy pottages. Isotope analysis from coastal cemeteries indicates high salt intake, likely from dried fish and brined olives bought as cheap snacks. Yet life expectancy for urban artisans still hovered near that of rural peasants, suggesting that occasional fritters harmed morals more than bodies if we accept the sermons. More lethal were the wooden buildings packed around open braziers, fires.
Ignited by careless piemen, raised whole districts of London in 1212 and Bergen in 1248. Every hiss of fat onto coals carried a hint of catastrophe. Moral panic, however, burned hotter than grease. By the 1400s, preachers in Florence raged against women who nibbled candied fennel seeds during Mass, calling the crunch of sugar the devil's rosary. English reformers warned that Lenten pretzels, shaped like crossed arms, mocked true devotion. Guildmasters in Ghent lobbied for curfews on nut roasters whose smoky carts kept apprentices from their beds. Yet prohibition seldom lasted. City councils needed stall fees. Pilgrims needed roadside pies. Soldiers needed energy on campaign. Regulations settled into a weary compromise. You could fry on saints' feast days if you paid the church a cut. You could sizzle meat on Fridays. If you posted a bishop's license, you could shout your wares outside monasteries only after the last bell. Gluttony, it seemed, was negotiable as long as it was profitable. Across the channel, the printing press began its quiet revolution. The earliest English cookbooks, c. 1470-1500, still targeted gentlefolk, but they included street sellers. Secrets such as batter ratios for puffed fritters, or spice blends that masked rancid lard. Recipes leached downward. Literate bakers recopied pamphlets. Illiterate fry cooks watched, smelled, and imitated. By the 16th century, London apprentices munched pointettes, pockets of dough stuffed with spiced mutton whose formula likely descended from a printed Italian Panzerotti guide. The page, once the domain of Latin theologians, had become a conveyor belt for junk food. Then came fires, plagues, and finally chimneys tall enough to vent indoor stoves. As homes gained hearth hooks and iron cauldrons, some street foods moved indoors. Others scaled up. In 17th century Holland, herring catch owners sold barrels of fish to cities, where vendors fried fillets on the dock, an ancestor of British fish and chips. In Paris, the traiteurs borrowed spice-thick gravies from medieval pie men and poured them over meat scraps, birthing the first takeaway stews. Even America's fairground funnel cake can trace its ancestry to German Strauben batter poured through a pierced ladle at Corpus Christi parades. Look closer at today's food trucks and late-night kebab shops and you will glimpse medieval silhouettes. The rolling griddle, the shouted refrain, the paper cone thrust into your handle, familiar across a gap of 600 years. Craving itself has not changed. We still want salt after toil, sugar after sorrow, something hot and handheld when dusk erases discipline. What has changed is who writes the story. A billion photographs document a donut. Nutritional labels log its molecules. Social feeds debate its morality. Future archaeologists will not sift charred crumbs, they'll drown in data. And yet they may still ask what we asked of the Middle Ages. In a civilization that recorded everything, why did the ordinary mouthfuls slip through? Perhaps the answer lies in perspective. 2 monarchs and bishops, a fritter was beneath notice. To a mason or maid, it was a fleeting treat unworthy of parchment because its memory lived in muscle and scent. We, too, file our fries as trivia while archiving crowns and crises. One day, a historian may scroll ancient servers and wonder why. Billions of snack photos survive, but so few captions explain the meaning of a drive-through, the social alchemy of
sharing chips at midnight, the quiet democracy of a street stall where strangers queue side by side. So the next time you tear open a crisp packet or fish a donut from a wax bag, imagine the apprentice in 1349 London licking honey from his thumb, the nun in 1420 Ghent secretly crunching almonds behind a cloister door, the sailor in 1503 Lisbon exchanging peppercorns for a skewer of sizzling sardines. Their cravings echo in yours, and if taste can bridge centuries so effortlessly, what else hopes, fears? Small defiances travels with it. The brazier embers fade to ash, the dogs pad away, and the square empties. Yet somewhere, just around a river bend you cannot see, a new stall is being unshuttered. Oil warms, dough rises, the eternal, insignificant hunger stirs again. Who will write it down this time? And when future generations sift our leftovers, will they find in our discarded wrappers a clearer portrait of us than we ever dared set to paper? When sleep-spoken symbols show are in the hush of a temple complex in ancient Mesopotamia. Sometime around 1300 BCE, the night air is heavy with incense and the drone of insects. Outside, the priest of the temple has lain a sleeping gnat upon a platform made of cool stone, angled just beneath the star-strewn sky. He sleeps with purpose, not for rest, not for escape, but for prophecy. You see, in this place and time, dreams are not regarded as idle nonsense or half-remembered hallucinations. They are communications cryptic and wholly from the gods themselves. And like many others across empires and centuries, this priest waits for the night to whisper its strange truths. Long before the invention of the pillow as we know it, people across the ancient world were trying to decode what dreams meant. They believed dreams were bridges between the mortal and divine, between what one knows and what one is meant to know. In Mesopotamia, the world's first recorded dream manuals were etched onto clay tablets, and their advice was strikingly detailed. A lion in a dream might mean you would defeat your enemies. A collapsing wall meant someone close to you was lying. Eating a fig might bring good fortune or illness depending on the phase of the moon. The Sumerians and Akkadians kept these records in ziggurats, vast step temples that loomed over cities like Eridu and Uruk. Dream interpreters were trained professionals, some were priests. Others were simply learned men with access to temple texts. They were called baru in Akkadian, meaning diviner. These interpreters worked not only from experience, but from organized guides, often assembled into reference works called dream omen texts. These weren't short booklets. One Babylonian dream manual, known as Iskerzuk, cataloged over 3,000 different types of dreams and their outcomes. The logic was not unlike reading the stars, or animal entrails, or the pattern of oil and water. But dream interpretation was more intimate. After all, your dreams were yours. The gods, or sometimes demons, were sending their messages specifically to you. This personal, sleepless form of consultation extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Ancient Egyptians were equally convinced that dreams came from the divine. In fact, they believed that dreams were journeys undertaken by the soul while the body slept. The Egyptians called the soul the Ba, which could temporarily leave the body during slumber, float through other worlds, and return with insight or warnings. One of the most fascinating artifacts we have from Egypt is the Ramesside Dream Book, written around 1275 BCE, likely during the reign of Ramesses II. It's a papyrus scroll containing about 108 dreams, each written with a dream description followed by its corresponding interpretation, marked clearly as good or bad. If a man dreams he sees himself eating crocodile meat, good. It means he will become a high official, one entry declares. Another says, if a man dreams he sees himself drinking warm beer, bad. It means morning is coming. What might sound random to us was likely encoded with cultural meaning. Crocodiles, after all, were symbols of raw power. Warm beer might have been associated with spoilage or decay, and dreams involving death or flying or nudity, those deeply human themes that still crop up in dreams today, had their own peculiar associations then. Often, they didn't mean what you might expect. To dream of dying, for instance, often meant rebirth or promotion, not loss. For the Greeks, dreams were more than just messengers, they were literal visitors. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, dreams are personified as winged figures who travel from the realm of sleep to deliver their messages. Zeus himself sends a deceitful dream to Agamemnon to stir up trouble. These were not just metaphors, they were part of the structure of belief. The Greeks even built temples where people could sleep overnight in the hopes of being visited by healing dreams. This practice was called incubation. In these Asclepian temples, named for the god of medicine, Asclepius patients would bathe, fast, and perform rituals before bedding down for the night. If they were lucky, Asclepius would appear to them in a dream and prescribe a treatment or cure. In some recorded cases, a person would dream of being cut open and healed, and afterward wake up claiming to feel completely well. Physicians and priests then recorded these accounts in stone, along with diagrams of miraculous recoveries as evidence of divine intervention. Dreams were seen as a medical diagnostic tool, a psychological window, and a message board from the gods. All at once, people from all classes sought dream interpretation: slaves, farmers, nobles, generals. The practice of interpreting dreams democratized the divine in a way. You didn't have to be rich or powerful to receive a vision from a god. You only had to sleep. But you did need help understanding what it meant. And that's where the professionals came in. We even find fragments of ancient dream interpreters advertising their services in marketplaces, offering insights for a small fee. Some were charlatans, of course, offering generic good fortune in exchange for coin. But others compiled detailed reference books, observed patterns, and kept case notes not unlike therapists today. One popular Roman-era dream interpreter, Artemidorus of Daldis, wrote an extensive manual around the 2nd century CE called the One-Ear Critica, or the Interpretation of Dreams. It was 5 books long and separated dreams into public and private categories. Dreams influenced by bodily humors, and even dreams that foretold the future. Artemidorus insisted that dreams must be interpreted within the context of the dreamer's station in life. A slave dreaming of being free, he explained, might signify hope or rebellion. But a free man dreaming the same might portend anxiety about responsibility. Eating hot food in a dream was good if you were a young man, but bad if you were elderly because digestion was understood differently at different life stages. His nuance was considerable, and his influence lasted well into the Middle Ages still. Despite its sophistication, dream interpretation was always under suspicion. As societies grew more monotheistic and centralized, dreams, especially when interpreted without priestly supervision, began to feel subversive. Prophets and mystics claimed to receive visions that threatened the political order. Dream manuals were banned or quietly dismissed as superstition. In Christian Europe, dreams were either divine revelations or temptations sent by demons. There was little room for ambiguity, but the hunger for meaning persisted throughout all these cultures. People kept dreaming of rivers and falling and strange animals that spoke in riddles. They dreamed of climbing ladders and being crowned or chased or swallowed. These images crossed continents and centuries, suggesting that while interpretations shifted, the raw material of dreams remained always stable. We dream with the same symbols our ancestors did. What changes is how we explain them. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, consider this. What if your dreams were once considered sacred? What if that strange dream you had last week, the one with the talking dog or the burning doorframe, might have earned you a visit to a temple in ancient Thebes or a clay tablet in Babylon? What if the oddness of your dreams is not randomness, but the echo of a long-forgotten conversation between the human mind and something far older? And more curiously still, what do we lose when we stop listening to our dreams? Imagine again the Asclepian, one of the most peaceful places in the ancient world. The soft burble of sacred springs, the cooing of doves, the scent of laurel, and the quiet rustling of linen robes fill the silence. It is not a hospital, not exactly. It is a sanctuary, a spiritual healing center spread across the hills of Epidaurus in ancient Greece. People come from miles away to lie down under the stars and dream. They are not just hoping for a good night's sleep. They are seeking a divine prescription. And dreams are the chosen channel. And Asclepians like this one. Patients went through ritual purification, fasting, bathing, praying before being allowed into the inner chambers, or open-air sleeping platforms called a baton. These sacred areas were shielded from the distractions of daily life. Those seeking healing would lie down in silence, hopeful that Asclepius or one of his snake-entwined attendants would visit them in their sleep and offer healing words or visions. Snakes, too, played an important role in this process. Non-venomous snakes, likely Aesculapian snakes, were kept in these temples and allowed to slither freely through the sleeping quarters. Their movements were thought to be omens, and their presence a direct extension of the god's power. If a patient dreamed of a snake coiling gently around them, it was a good sign symbolizing renewal, rebirth, the shedding of pain. Snakes did not frighten in these temples, they reassured. Inscriptions from these places survive etched into stone stelae like testimonials. One account reads, "I was lame in both feet. I came to the temple. I slept. The god appeared and touched my feet. I woke and walked away." Another describes a man with severe eye disease who dreamed that the god applied salve to his eyelids. Upon waking, he could see again. Whether these cures were spontaneous, psychosomatic, or slow recoveries misattributed to sleep visions, No one can say for sure. But what mattered most was belief. The body, the ancients believed, responded to faith, especially when whispered through dreams. In the ancient Near East, dream interpretation didn't always have such tranquil trappings. In Assyria, kings employed professional dream interpreters, not for healing, but for military and political guidance. One wrong interpretation could change the course of war. King Ashurbanipal, for instance, had entire libraries of omen texts copied and studied, believing them crucial to managing the empire. Before major campaigns, generals would consult dream priests, hoping to determine whether divine favor or disaster awaited them. It was a high-stakes business, even in Rome. Emperors and senators paid close attention to dreams, although not everyone took them seriously. Cicero, the statesman and philosopher, was famously skeptical in his treatise De Divination. He discusses dreams at length, often with thinly veiled sarcasm. Why, he asks, should a god choose to communicate the fate of an empire through the image of a falling pomegranate? Still, even Cicero admitted that some dreams seemed uncanny in their timing and meaning. His own political career was marred by omens he chose to ignore. More than one Roman leader was undone by a dream. Calpurnia, wife of Julius Caesar, famously dreamt that her husband would be murdered in her vision. His statue poured blood and people bathed their hands in it. She pleaded with him not to go to the Senate. He ignored her. The rest, of course, is history. Whether the dream was real or embellished later is poetic hindsight. It became a kind of cultural echo, a reminder that the gods may speak to us in riddles we ignore at our peril. By the time the Roman Empire gave way to Christianized Europe, dream interpretation found itself caught between reverence and repression. On one hand, the Bible was full of prophetic dreams, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's vision of fat and thin cows, or the angel appearing to Joseph in the New Testament, warning him to flee with Mary and the infant Jesus. On the other hand, dreams were often suspected of being invitations to sin, delusions planted by demons, or remnants of pagan superstition. Church fathers like Augustine struggled to define when dreams were acceptable and when they strayed into dangerous territory. Was a dream from God, from the devil, from indigestion? The source mattered deeply. If a dream was considered divine, it could justify a war, a religious order, or a lifetime of repentance. If it was demonic, it could lead to persecution or madness. Monastic manuals began to include warnings against trusting dreams. Some even advised monks to confess their dreams as they would their sins. Yet dream interpretation never fully vanished. In quieter corners of medieval Europe, monks kept dream journals. In the Islamic world, scholars wrote new manuals, combining classical Greek theories with Quranic insights. One such writer was Ibn Sirin, an 8th century Muslim mystic whose book The Interpretation of Dreams became one of the most influential texts on the subject in the Islamic Golden Age. His work blended religious tradition with careful psychological observation. For example, he cautioned that dreaming of a house on fire might mean spiritual distress unless the fire provided warmth and comfort, in which case it could mean illumination. He also emphasized the character and state of the dreamer. The same dream could mean different things to different people. To dream of flying might suggest piety and a devout person, but escapism or instability in someone less grounded. This echoes Artemidore's teachings centuries earlier, proving how resilient the structure of symbolic logic remained across time and cultures. What we see across these diverse civilizations is a continuous attempt to balance trust in the supernatural with doubt, observation, and pattern seeking. Whether in the shadow of a ziggurat, the cool stone halls of a Greek temple, or the candlelit cell of a medieval monk, people return to their dreams hoping for direction, clarity, or healing. The fact that dreams remained so elusive only made them more valuable. Interestingly, not all dreams were welcomed, some were feared, and dreamers themselves could be viewed with suspicion. In medieval and early modern Europe, to claim too many Visions was to risk accusations of heresy or madness. Women in particular, especially mystics, often walked a thin line. A dream that predicted a famine or plague might earn a woman respect as a prophet, or denunciation as a witch. Joan of Arc famously claimed that visions and voices guided her every step. For that, she was both celebrated and burned. And so dream interpretation continued to evolve, sometimes as sacred art, sometimes as pseudoscience, sometimes as rebellion. Its status rose and fell with the politics of the time. Yet people never stopped dreaming, and they never stopped wondering what those dreams meant. In every age, there were those who lay awake in the early hours, wondering if a vision of a broken ladder or a golden bird carried some deeper message. Why, we might ask, were people so desperate to decode their dreams? Was it fear of the future, desire for control, or was it something simpler, the belief that the universe is not silent, but speaks to us in symbols if only we would learn to listen? And in that long silence after waking, how do we tell whether the dream was just a trick of the brain or something more? As the medieval world passed into the Renaissance, the way people understood dreams began to shift. The stars still shone, and temples still stood, some crumbling into history, but the questions remained. What did dreams mean? Were they divine dispatches, muddled memories, or something far more intimate? With the rise of humanism and early scientific inquiry in Europe, dreams slowly loosened from the grasp of priests and prophets and began drifting toward scholars, physicians, and natural philosophers. What had once been treated as direct messages from gods was now considered by some as mental residue, reflections of waking thoughts. Physical ailments or emotional stress, still, the curiosity remained intense. In 16th century Europe, dream books were printed and circulated widely, much like early almanacs. These books promised answers to common dream symbols: teeth falling out, floods, weddings, fire, and flight. They were used by everyone from farmers to nobility. Some even used them as lottery guides, interpreting dreams numerically to choose lucky numbers. In a way, the commercialization of dream interpretation represented a cultural democratization. One no longer needed a priest, a philosopher, or divine permission to interpret a dream. One needed only a few coins and a willingness to believe. But something deeper was beginning to stir beneath the surface. Enlightenment thinkers like René Descartes began dissecting the mind itself, separating dream from reality in philosophical terms. Dreams were now a puzzle, not a prophecy. I dream, therefore I am confused, might well have been the subtext. To Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Skepticism grew, but so did fascination. What were dreams for? In the 19th century, this fascination reached a turning point. With the growth of psychiatry and neurology, dreams were pulled out of temples and placed on couches. The modern era of dream interpretation began not in incense-scented chambers, but in the book-lined study of an Austrian Dr. Sigmund Freud. Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, revived the ancient tradition in a new language. He proposed that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, instead of gods or demons. Dreams were shaped by suppressed desires, memories, and anxieties. Dreams were coded expressions of repressed wishes, especially those too uncomfortable for the waking mind. Freud's model was both radical and familiar. Like the Babylonian dream interpreters before him, he believed the dreams contained messages that needed decoding. But his dictionary was different. A tower didn't mean victory, it meant a phallic symbol. A train entering a tunnel wasn't good fortune, it was an unconscious sexual wish. Freud's dream logic was intimate, awkward, and deeply psychological. Many rejected Freud's interpretations as speculative or overly focused on sexuality. But his core idea that dreams are meaningful, symbolic, and worth interpreting resonated deeply. His student and eventual rival, Carl Jung, expanded this idea further. Jung believed that dreams weren't just personal, they were also collective. He introduced the concept of the collective unconscious, a shared human reservoir of myths and symbols. To Jung, dreaming of a snake might mean much more than fear or renewal. It might tap into an archetype, a primal story shared across all cultures. Jung's dream theory was more spiritual than Freud's, echoing ancient practices. He saw dreams as a dialogue between the self and something larger, older, and wiser. From Jung's perspective, modern dreamers were no different from the Egyptians or the Greeks. We still chase symbols. We still sense that dreams mean something even. And we can't say what, whether the dream shows a crumbling bridge, a shadowy figure, or a child we never met. We wake with the same question our ancestors did. Why did I dream this? And in the 20th century, as psychology grew in popularity, dream interpretation went mainstream once again. Bookshelves filled with dream dictionaries. Therapists encouraged dream journaling. Films and literature began treating dreams not as curiosities, but as profound story elements. In Franz Kafka's work, in Ingmar Bergman's films, and surrealist art, dreams reasserted their mysterious weight. The counterculture of the 1960s, with its interest in mysticism, psychedelics, and Eastern philosophy, embraced dreams as spiritual tools once more. Tibetan dream yoga, lucid dreaming, and shamanic vision quests all found renewed interest. People began experimenting with keeping dream journals, setting intentions before bed, and analyzing their dreams not just for meaning, but for personal growth. In contemporary times, neuroscience offers a more mechanical explanation. We know that dreams occur during REM, rapid eye movement sleep. We know that certain brain regions light up, particularly those tied to emotion and memory. We also know that our brains continue to process information and solve problems during sleep. And yet, even with the tools of brain scans and psychology, we still don't fully understand why we dream. Theories abound. Dreams help consolidate memories, rehearse survival strategies, regulate emotions, or simply flush out mental noise. But none of these quite explain why dreams feel meaningful, why a dream can leave us haunted for days, or grant sudden clarity on a waking problem. Despite centuries of effort, dream interpretation remains uncertain. No universal key exists. What means fear for one might mean hope for another. What brings terror in one culture may bring honor in another. And in that ambiguity lies the enduring power of dreams. So what do we make of this long, winding path? From clay tablets to psychotherapy couches, from temples filled with snakes to modern phone apps that track REM cycles, dreams have always walked alongside us, whispering in strange tongues. They have been feared, banned, analyzed, commercialized, and revered, but they have never been ignored. Perhaps that is their greatest significance, not in what they predict or in what they reveal, but in the simple fact that they persist. Every culture, every age, has dreamed in the quiet darkness. When the body lies still and the mind wanders, we return to the oldest of conversations, the one that begins in sleep and never quite ends. So the next time you drift off, and a strange vision visits you, a staircase into a forest, a forgotten face, a burst of golden light, you might remember that you are not alone. You are part of an unbroken chain of dreamers, stretching back thousands of years. Priests, queens, slaves, philosophers, scribes, and you each trying to make sense of what sleep reveals. And perhaps the real mystery is not what dreams mean, but why we keep needing them to mean something at all. The founding of the Pony Express 1860. You are standing in St. Joseph, Missouri. It is the spring of 1860. The Mississippi River glints behind you. The last silver line before the land opens westward into vast prairies, jagged mountains, and desert expanses. The smell of horses and wetwood lingers in the morning air, and the streets are caked with a mix of rain and hoof prints. This is where the idea of speed, unthinkable speed, for its time will begin to reshape communication across the continent. This is where the Pony Express will be born. In an era before telegraphs reached California, when railroads stopped far short of the Pacific, messages from the east took weeks to reach the west. Steamships were slow, stagecoaches slower, and settlers out on the frontier remained months behind in news, orders, and national decisions. The United States was growing at an awkward pace, limbs extending faster. The nerves could carry signals. Enter three men, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell Freight, and transport magnates who believed they could shorten that unbearable gap. Their plan was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. Establish a relay of horse riders who could carry mail from Missouri to Sacramento in just 10 days. It would take hundreds of horses, dozens of riders, and more than 100 stations spread out across 1,966 miles of unforgiving terrain. They called it the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company. History would call it the Pony Express. At first glance, the plan seemed absurd. There were deserts with no water, mountain passes snowed under 9 months of the year, and stretches of land where nothing lived but sagebrush and silence. But to Americans of the 19th century, driven by the unrelenting drumbeat of manifest destiny, the impossible was simply the next milestone. Riders would be young, most between 14 and 20 years old. They had to be lightweight, weary, and fearless. Adverts sought young, skinny, weary fellows, not over 18. Must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Whether this ad ever truly existed is debated, but the sentiment is accurate. The job was deadly. The pay, by most accounts, was $25 a week, about 10 times the average wage, but that was not enough to attract anyone, except the boldest, most desperate, or most curious. Each rider was issued a revolver, a knife, and sometimes a bugle. They wore buckskin jackets and rode in all weather, day and night, with only a few minutes to rest at relay stations before mounting a fresh horse and galloping off again. Each man carried a special piece of equipment, the mochila, light leather saddle cover with 4 mail pouches that could be quickly transferred from one horse to another. Speed was everything. And speed, truly, was what they achieved. From St. Joseph to Sacramento, they covered nearly 2,000 miles in about 10 days. Mail that had previously taken 3 weeks by stagecoach now reached its destination in a third of the time. The first run began on April 3, 1860. A young rider left St. Joseph and galloped west, carrying telegrams, letters, and the future on his back. But the Pony Express was not only a logistical marvel, it was a test of the land itself. Riders passed through the Great Plains, crossed the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada, and galloped through territories where native tribes watched with suspicion or resistance. Harsh weather, hunger, and exhaustion were constant companions. Stories abound of riders who rode to 100 miles without sleep, of horses collapsing mid-run, of stations attacked and destroyed. Each station was roughly 10 to 15 miles apart, just far enough for a horse to run at top speed before needing replacement. Every 75 to 100 miles, the rider himself would change. The mail never stopped. Neither rain nor snow nor threat of ambush would slow it, at least not officially. But it wasn't just the riders or the horses that made it work. It was the invisible chain of station masters, stable hands, and supply crews, hundreds of anonymous laborers who kept the fragile line running. Some lived in complete isolation, keeping the station stocked and the horses ready, listening for the distant thunder of hooves that would mean a handoff was coming. The infrastructure was delicate. One break in the line through snow, war, or sabotage, and the whole system faltered. Yet somehow, for 18 months, the Pony Express held fast. Still, even as it galloped into legend, the clock was ticking. The telegraph wires were creeping westward. A faster, cheaper, and more reliable means of communication loomed on the horizon. Everyone involved in the Pony Express knew it. They were racing not just time, but obsolescence. And yet, for those 18 months, they ran anyway. So what drove them? Was it the thrill of danger, the promise of money, or something deeper, the need to feel useful, fast, alive in a country too vast for comfort. And when the last rider dismounted and the wires took over, did the silence that followed feel like progress or a kind of loss? Imagine yourself now at a way station deep in the open plains of Nebraska Territory, mid-1860. The sun has dipped just below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the prairie. You're stationed here alone or with one partner. If you're lucky, your job is simple. Be ready. A rider is due at any moment, and when he arrives, exhausted and covered in dust, you have no more than 2 minutes to swap saddles, hand him water, feed the horse if needed, and send him galloping off again. This was the quiet, invisible backbone of the Pony Express, the station masters and swing station hands. While the riders caught the spotlight and the mythos, the men who ran these outposts often faced harsher monotony, longer stretches of isolation, and more lingering danger. At the height of the Express, there were about 190 stations, spaced 10 to 15 miles apart, and each one served as a vital link in the chain. There were the types of stations, home stations, where riders switched out and could briefly eat and sleep, and swing stations, where only horses were changed. The home stations were more substantial, often small cabins, forts, or converted ranch houses. Swing stations might be little more than a sod shack, a corral, and a stable boy with sharp ears and fast hands. At many of these stations, there were no fences, no telegraphs, no neighbors, just wind, silence, and the occasional blur of hooves approaching from the east or the west. Supplies had to be hauled in, sometimes over hundreds of miles. Water, wood, oats, and flour were lifelines. A miscalculation meant starvation or being stranded without enough feed for the horses, and yet the system mostly worked. Why? Because the men involved grizzled mountain men, enterprising frontiersmen, immigrants, and young adventurers treated it like a mission, even if they couldn't explain why it mattered. They seemed to know that it did. The riders, meanwhile, were the flesh and blood of the Express. They had to be incredibly fit, not just in body, but in will. Imagine riding 75 to 100 miles in a single shift, sometimes longer, when another station was burned or a replacement failed to arrive. Your only company is a horse and a leather saddlebag full of letters. You ride through scorching heat, blizzards, flooded riverbeds, and steep passes. You sleep on the ground, if at all. You live on salted meat, beans, and boiled coffee, often prepared hastily at a station whose walls still bear the scars of the last skirmish. And the threats were real. Riders were frequently targeted by thieves, Confederate sympathizers, or native tribes resisting expansion into their lands. The Paiute War of 1860, for example, disrupted major sections of the express line in Nevada. Dozens of stations were attacked, destroyed, or abandoned. Some riders were killed, some vanished, and others rode longer than ever intended to maintain the flow of mail. Despite these challenges, the riders became folk heroes. Names like William Buffalo Bill Cody entered American legend, though. The details of his involvement with the Pony Express remain heavily embellished. In truth, most riders went unnamed in the records. They came and went, often leaving behind nothing more than a nickname, a date of hire, and a pay stub. Still, they rode through country now called Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, then still raw, unnamed, and unpredictable. They passed over salt flats where nothing grew, through forests where paths were only partially cleared, and into snowstorms that could blind a man in minutes. Many rode armed, but speed, not confrontation, was their defense. And then there were the horses, the unsung heroes, fast, durable, and light-footed. They were often of Mustang or half-thoroughbred stock. A good horse could keep a rider alive. Some reports suggest the express stable between 400 and 500 horses at any given time. They were changed frequently to maintain the blistering pace every 10 to 15 miles, requiring perfect coordination across all those stations. Yet despite all this effort and coordination, The Pony Express was never a financial success. It was a public relations stunt as much as it was a logistical operation. The founders hoped to win a long-term government mail contract, but the venture hemorrhaged money from day one. Still, they persisted, pouring resources into an endeavor they knew would be short-lived once the telegraph reached completion. Mail carried by the Pony Express wasn't cheap either. At the start, the rate was $5 per half ounce, a small fortune at the time equivalent to roughly $150 today. Eventually, rates were reduced to $1 per half ounce, but the service remained a luxury, typically used for government dispatches, military orders, and time-sensitive business communications. For ordinary citizens, it was too expensive to use regularly. Ironically, many letters delivered by the Express were never even opened with urgency. There are reports of businessmen in Sacramento who received the mail promptly, then waited several days before reading it. It was not so much the speed that mattered as the idea of speed, proof that the nation could defy its own vastness. And that brings us to the heart of the Pony Express, not as a practical solution, but as a symbolic one. In 1860, the nation stood at the brink of civil war. The divide between East and West wasn't just geographical, it was cultural, economic, and increasingly political. The Pony Express bridged that divide not permanently, not perfectly, but dramatically. For a few breathless months, Americans could imagine themselves as part of something connected, something fast, something modern. And yet, as the wires crept west and the cost of transmitting words by electricity dropped, the riders became obsolete. By late 1861, the telegraph had reached Salt Lake City and then Sacramento. On October 26, 1861, just 18 months after the first ride, the Pony Express officially ended. The last mail was delivered, the riders dismounted, the horses rested, but the stations remained, some falling into disuse, others converted into trading posts or telegraph offices, and the legend of the Express took on a life of its own. In books, Wild West shows, and collective memory, the image of the lone rider galloping through the night would outlive the actual service by over a century. What is it about that image that still captures us? You're standing again in St. Joseph, Missouri, but it's late October 1861 now. The flags are still waving along the station yard, but the mood is subdued. There's a new wire strung taut across the telegraph poles running west out of town. No more galloping hooves, no more frantic station changes, no more riders silhouetted against the horizon. The Pony Express has come to a quiet end, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a telegram. On October 24, 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. It connected California to the existing network of lines in the east. 2 days later, the Pony Express was officially shut down, just 18 months after it began. The wild dream of rapid mail by horseback had been overtaken by the humming of wire. And yet those 18 months had changed the American imagination financially. The Pony Express was a disaster. It lost somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000, a colossal sum in the 1860s. Its parent company, Russell, Majors and Waddell, went bankrupt shortly afterward. The long-anticipated government mail contract never materialized. Instead, the Overland Mail Company and the U.S. Post Office threw their support behind newer technologies and rail lines. The Express, for all its speed, had been outpaced by inevitability. But even as the last mail bag was unloaded, its myth was already forming. Newspapers had covered the Express with fascination. Americans in both the East and the expanding West had come to associate the Pony Express with daring, heroism, and progress, even if most had never used its services or known anyone who had ridden for it. Perhaps part of its magic came from how temporary it was. Like the comet you only see once in a lifetime, the Pony Express flared briefly and disappeared. It was a bridge between the pre-industrial and the modern, between myth and machine, and the writers, many of them now jobless teenagers with calloused hands and exhausted legs, went back to lives less legendary. Some drifted into other frontier jobs, ranching, mining, scouting. A few found employment with the military, especially as the Civil War broke out in earnest. A handful, like William F. Cody, rebranded themselves into full-blown folk heroes through dime novels and traveling shows. But for most, their time as Pony Express riders became little more than a story told in saloons and around campfires long before it was celebrated in textbooks. It wasn't until decades later that the memory of the Express became formalized into history. In 1925, the U.S. Post Office issued a Pony Express commemorative stamp. In the 1930s and 40s, the image of the brave, galloping rider became standard iconography for the American West. Hollywood embraced it, historians romanticized it, but the details blurred. In truth, many of the things we believe about the Pony Express are half myth. Riders didn't carry only the most urgent messages, sometimes they carried advertising and ordinary letters if the postage was paid. Their routes weren't always uninterrupted. Riders did sometimes delay for safety or weather. And not every ride was a dramatic sprint under moonlight. Many were routine, even dull. The average speed across the entire route wasn't constant gallop, but something closer to 10 miles per hour, factoring in changes, terrain, and rest. Yet in many ways, the dullness makes the Express even more extraordinary. Because the real story of the Pony Express isn't about outlaws or gunfights. It's about logistics, planning, endurance. Hundreds of workers operating in perfect coordination across nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness. Horses groomed, trails maintained, fires lit, coffee brewed, and stations repaired so that a message could make it across the country in less than 2 weeks. And it worked for 18 months. In the middle of a continent that hadn't yet figured out how to hold itself together politically, economically, or technologically, this fragile network of boys on horseback stitched east and west into one conversation. What's more, it foreshadowed the communications race that would define the modern world. First came the Pony Express, then the telegraph, then telephone wires, fiber optics, satellites, and wireless data. The need to connect across vast distances to compress time and space has always driven us. But the Pony Express was among the first, most desperate attempts to do so at national scale. It also marked a pivotal point in the conquest and colonization of the West. The stations and trails it followed would later serve other purposes. Stagecoach lines would run where the riders once galloped. Settlements sprang up around the most reliable posts, and when the Civil War ended and railroads pushed westward again, the old Pony Express route became part of the corridor through which the United States stretched its physical and ideological reach to the Pacific. Today, little remains of the original stations, a few stone foundations, a scattered marker, some recreations. The landscape has changed, but the story endures less for what it achieved and more for what it tried to do. It's tempting to remember only the romantic parts. The midnight ride, the weary but determined face of the young courier, the thunder of hooves in the dark. But the real Pony Express lived in the in-between moments, and a boy waiting for his horse, at a lonely station, and a cook boiling coffee for the 100th time, and a line of dusty letters that no one remembers anymore. What does it say about us that we forget the names of those who built it, but remember the blur of their motion? And what other impossible things, short-lived, half-forgotten, deeply human, once tied our world together, only to vanish the moment something faster arrived? The history of ancient brewing. Close your eyes and picture a low mud brick dwelling along the banks of the Euphrates River. The year is somewhere around 4000 BCE, though no one calls it that yet. This is summer in the land of ancient Mesopotamia, where the earliest cities are taking form under a sky more filled with smoke from hearths than from temples. Inside this modest home, a woman kneels near a clay pot, watching as it thick. Porridge like mashed bubbles softly in the heat. The smell is earthy, sweet, and sour, grainy, and warm. She doesn't know it, but she's brewing beer, one of humanity's oldest and most enduring crafts. To understand the history of ancient brewing is to step back not just into a lost recipe book, but into the foundation of civilization itself. Brewing beer wasn't a footnote of ancient life, it was part of the very structure. In many of the world's earliest agricultural societies, beer was not just a luxury, it was food, payment, ritual, and science wrapped into one muddy, foaming cup. Though exact timelines vary, the earliest archaeological evidence for brewing comes from the Middle East, particularly from sites in modern-day Iran and Iraq. Ceramic jars from the Neolithic village of Godin Tepe, for example, contain chemical residues consistent with fermentation, suggesting that as far back as 3500 BCE, people were intentionally creating alcohol from grain. But how did this discovery happen? One popular theory suggests it was by accident. Grain stored in damp conditions may have begun to ferment naturally, creating a frothy, mildly intoxicating liquid. Someone tasted it, perhaps skeptically, and found it not only drinkable, but strangely pleasurable. Over time, this chance occurrence became ritualized. Techniques were passed down, refined, and celebrated. In ancient Sumer, brewing became a respected occupation, closely linked to women. The Sumerians had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, whose praise him from around 1800 BCE. Maybe one of the world's oldest surviving beer recipes. It reads like both poetry and instruction manual. You are the one who waters the malt set on the ground. You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. You are the one who spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats. The process was simple, but brilliant. Grains, most often barley or emmer wheat, were partially germinated and then dried to create malt. This malt was ground into flour, mixed with water, and sometimes combined with a kind of bread called babir, which was twice baked and dry, making it ideal for storage and later brewing. The resulting mixture was allowed to ferment thanks to wild yeast in the air, and the brew was stored in large, open clay vessels. The final product was not beer as we know it today. It was more like a thick, soupy ale, often cloudy with residual grains, consumed through a straw to avoid the sediment. Some versions were sweetened with dates or flavored with herbs, and while it may sound unappetizing by modern standards, it was widely loved and carefully crafted. The Sumerians believed that beer had divine origins. To brew it well was to cooperate with the gods. Beer also served practical purposes. In a time when clean water was far from guaranteed low alcohol, beer provided a safer alternative to potentially contaminated river or well water. Its mild alcohol content and nutrients made it a daily staple, particularly for laborers, who were sometimes paid in beer rations. And this wasn't unique to Sumer. Across the Nile in ancient Egypt, beer was equally essential. Egyptian beer, often made with emmer wheat and flavored with honey or herbs, was consumed by pharaohs and peasants alike. Tomb paintings and temple records describe its preparation, distribution, and spiritual importance. It was offered to the gods in temples and consumed during feasts and funerals. Much like in Mesopotamia, brewing in Egypt was also typically overseen by women. Some evidence suggests that in large estates, professional brewers may have operated out of dedicated breweries, turning out large batches daily. Beer was used in trade, gifted to temples, and served in military rations. Workers who built the pyramids, for instance, received daily beer allotments alongside bread as part of their wages. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, beer played a central role in medicine, too. Ancient texts list beer-based concoctions as treatments for everything from stomachaches to tooth infections. It was believed to purify, warm, and soothe the body. Whether it truly helped or not, it gave people comfort and effect not unfamiliar even now. Meanwhile, other cultures developed their own forms of brewing. In ancient China, archaeological findings from the Jiahu site around 7000 BCE suggest a fermented beverage Made from rice, honey, and fruit, though not strictly beer. It served a similar social and ceremonial function in the Andean highlands of South America. The Inca and their predecessors brewed chicha, a corn beer made by chewing kernels to break down starches before fermentation. This drink was central to rituals, feasting, and agricultural celebrations. What ties all these early brewing traditions together is a striking fact. The birth of beer appears almost everywhere that agriculture emerges. Grain farming and fermentation go hand in hand. Some historians even argue that early people may have been drawn to farming not primarily for bread, but for beer. The desire to create a steady supply of intoxicating, nourishing drink may have spurred innovations in storage, crop management, and cooking. Brewing, in this sense, wasn't a hobby. It was civilization. And so, the simple act of bubbling mash in a clay pot becomes something much larger. It's a technological achievement, a cultural touchstone, a moment of chemistry and curiosity frozen in time. It's a mother's knowledge passed to her daughter, a priest offering at a temple altar, a day laborer's reward at sunset. But brewing wasn't only about practicality. It also offered a moment of transformation, of water into something warm and lively, of grain into something communal. It brought people together around shared cups and songs. It blurred the lines between the sacred and the ordinary, the mundane and the meaningful. And that raises an interesting question. What did ancient people feel when they drank this early beer? Not just the effects of alcohol, but the meaning behind it. Was it relief, celebration, a moment of rest, or something deeper, a connection to ancestors, to gods, to the land itself? Now picture a dusty cart rolling slowly along a trade route in the eastern Mediterranean. The wheel rumbles over uneven stones, pulled by a groaning mule, while the cart itself carries sacks of barley, clay every seal with wax, and a few dried cakes of something that looks like old bread. The merchant driving the cart is sweating under the late afternoon sun, but he whistles as he goes. He knows there's a market ahead where people will pay good silver for the strange drink packed in his jars, a drink called beer. By the 2nd millennium BCE, beer was no longer just a Mesopotamian or Egyptian staple. It had become an economic product, traded, taxed, and transported between cultures. And as it traveled, it changed shape by climate, grains, local customs, and the people who carried it. In a way, the spread of beer tells the same story as the spread of ideas, language, and power across the ancient world. Let's begin with the Hittites, an Anatolian people based in what is now Turkey. They were influenced by both Mesopotamian and Syrian brewing traditions, and by 1400 BCE, beer was part of their ritual life. Texts in the Hittite archives mention brewing and consumption in ceremonial contexts, sometimes linked with specific deities or agricultural rites. As in summer, beer was not only an everyday drink, but a symbol of seasonal fertility and the gifts of the gods. In the Levant, beer had a more complicated fate. The Canaanites and later the Israelites were aware of it, but wine held the dominant cultural position. The climate in that region made grape cultivation relatively easy, and while beer was still consumed especially by lower classes, or in areas near Mesopotamian influence, wine became the prestige drink. This divide would persist for centuries, with beer associated with the north and east, and wine with the south and west. Even in the Hebrew Bible, beer or sheker appears occasionally, but often in cautionary or neutral terms, certainly never as sacred as wine. Meanwhile, in Europe, beer had already taken root long before the Roman Empire arrived. Archaeological finds in Germany and Central Europe point to fermented grain beverages being made as early as 2500 BCE, especially among the Celtic and Germanic tribes. These early beers were quite different from their Middle Eastern cousins. For one, the grains used were more likely to be millet, spelt, or oat, depending on local availability. Second, the brewing process was more rustic, often involving communal or household-scale production without elaborate filtration or additives. The Greeks, when they encountered this kind of beer, were not impressed. They called it xiphos from the Egyptian word, and though it was known, it was rarely praised. The Greeks saw wine as the drink of civilization, refined, balanced, intellectual. Beer, in contrast, was considered a bit crude, associated with barbarians and the lower orders of society. Plato himself suggested that wine was suitable for philosophers, but beer was for those too uncultured to appreciate the finer points of thought. The Romans inherited this view, though they were more pragmatic. In the vast frontiers of the empire, particularly in Gaul, Britannia, and the Germanic lands, beer was widely consumed by local populations and often brewed in large quantities. Roman garrisons stationed in these regions often adopted local drinks out of necessity. We have records of Roman soldiers receiving beer rations when stationed beyond the reach of vineyards. Though Roman elites continued to prefer wine, they tolerated beer as a provincial custom and even taxed it where appropriate. What's fascinating is that the Romans, while snobbish, were not entirely dismissive of beer's potential. They understood that brewing required skill and that beer could be nutritious. But in their cultural worldview, wine symbolized the Mediterranean ideal order, art, and control. Beer was viewed as rustic, chaotic, and foreign. That distinction lingered long after the empire fell. Elsewhere, beer was developing its own sophisticated traditions. In China, the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 56 BCE, had multiple words for different types of fermented grain, drinks being the most general term. Chinese brewers used a variety of base ingredients: millet, rice, wheat, and developed complex fermentation starters known as ku, a blend of mold, yeast, and bacteria that broke down starches and gave the drink unique flavors. Some Chinese beers were mild and cloudy, others sweet and strong. These beverages were served in ceremonial contexts and at court, often linked with Confucian ideas about moderation and ritual propriety. Across the ocean, in Mesoamerica, a different form of brewing was flourishing. The Maya and Aztec cultures drank a corn-based beer known as chicha or tezcuino, depending on the region and technique. This beer was made by chewing corn to introduce salivary enzymes that began breaking down the starchy communal and intimate form of brewing. The result was a lightly alcoholic drink, often thick and consumed fresh. These beers had spiritual and social functions, often consumed in rituals, feasts, and agricultural festivals. In the Andes, chicha remained central to Inca society. Women, particularly those from noble lineages, were trained in brewing as part of their education. Chicha was not just a drink, it was a diplomatic tool, a ritual offering, and a way to bind communities together. By this point in history, beer had become truly global, not in the sense of identical recipes, but in the idea of fermented grain as a communal, cultural creation. Each region had its own methods, preferences, and meanings, but the underlying impulse was the same: to transform simple crops into something greater. That transformation required knowledge not just of ingredients, but of time, temperature, and chemistry. Ancient brewers had no thermometers or microscopes. They worked through observation, tradition, and intuition. They could tell when the mash was ready by its smell. They knew how long to ferment by the sound of the bubbles or the feel of the pot. Brewing was not random, it was a delicate balance of patience, skill, and practice. In many cultures, brewers held semi-sacred status. They were keepers of recipes, initiates of invisible processes. Some may have been seen as magical, even prophetic people, who could create intoxication without violence, transformation without destruction. And wherever beer went, it helped define identity. To drink the local brew was to be part of that place. But beer's popularity also brought risks. As brewing became more widespread, it invited control. In some cities, beer was taxed heavily. In others, Brewing was regulated by temples or rulers. Quality varied wildly, leading to disputes and early forms of consumer protection. In a few cases, fake or poorly made beer caused sickness or worse. The line between sacred drink and spoiled swill was a thin one, and yet people kept brewing. Across rivers, mountains, deserts, and empires, they soaked the grain, stirred the mash, waited for bubbles, and shared the results. Why? What drove so many cultures to pursue this complicated, time-consuming craft? Was it just the alcohol, the calories, the flavor, or was it something else, something about the way brewing slowed life down, turned labor into ritual, and gave people a reason to gather, pause, and share? Imagine standing in the shadow of a ziggurat in the city of found 2100 BC. The bricks are sunbaked and warm beneath your hands, but all around you is the hum of human order, scribes tallying lists on clay tablets, priests chanting softly to themselves, merchants haggling over sacks of barley. Nearby, workers unload enormous jars of a cloudy, fragrant liquid. Each one is sealed with a thumbprint and the symbol of a brewing house. This isn't trade, it's taxation. The beer is being collected, redistributed, and rationed. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer was a form of governance. By the third section of this story, the humble act of fermentation has expanded far beyond a domestic hearth or village celebration. Beer, by this point, is deeply entangled with ancient systems of law, power, spirituality, and even identity. It's no longer just a drink, it's an institution. Let's return for a moment to Mesopotamia, where the oldest known legal codes are etched in stone. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1750 for BC, doesn't just regulate theft or marriage, it includes strict rules about taverns and brewers. One law, for instance, mandates that if a tavern keeper overcharges for beer or waters it down, they could be put to death by drowning. Another dictates that priestesses who enter taverns may be burned alive. These are severe, even horrifying penalties, but their inclusion reveals something crucial. Beer was so important that governing it was inseparable from governing people. Beer served as currency, wage, offering, and punishment. Workers received daily rations, temples stored surplus brew in vast underground cellars, and taverns lively hubs of news, gossip, and social friction had to be tightly controlled. Because wherever beer flowed, ideas followed. The beer economy in Egypt functioned much the same. The pyramids, for example, weren't built by enslaved people so much as by a rotating workforce of paid laborers, men who received bread, onions, and beer as their primary diet. Wall inscriptions from the time of Pharaoh Khufu record rations of 4 to 5 liters of beer per day per worker, not as a luxury, but as a staple, mild enough to hydrate, strong enough to fuel the body, and thick enough to keep hunger at bay. And again, this wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. In Egyptian cosmology, beer was a link to the divine. One myth tells of the goddess Sekhmet, who became so enraged she nearly destroyed humanity. To stop her, the gods dyed beer red to resemble blood and flooded the land with it. Sekhmet drank deeply, became intoxicated, and fell asleep, saving the world from her wrath. The moral? Beer could soothe even the divine when wielded with care. So it's not surprising that beer was often included in offerings to gods and the dead. Tomb goods from both elite and commoner burials frequently include small jars and cups, sometimes even modeling scenes of beer brewing in miniature. The message was clear. You would need this drink in the afterlife. Over in ancient China, brewing had a similarly sacred role. Ritual bronze vessels from the Shang and Zhou dynasties, roughly 1600 to 56 BC, were specifically designed for holding fermented drinks used in ancestor worship. These brews, made with millet and other grains, were part of the liturgical structure of Chinese spirituality. Offerings of alcohol were necessary to keep the ancestors pleased, and the world in balance. The Chinese elite even employed brewmasters as part of their court staff. These specialists understood the delicate timing of fermentation, seasonal variations in climate, and the proper method for preparing drinks suitable for ritual. Their role was akin to a combination of chef, chemist, and priest. In Mesoamerica, the ceremonial use of beer reached equally elaborate heights. Among the Inca, the brewing and serving of chicha was a matter of state. In Cusco, the empire's capital, entire buildings were dedicated to brewing the sacred drink. The most important women, called akla, or chosen women, were taught to make chicha as part of their sacred duties. When foreign dignitaries visited, chicha was poured into golden cups and offered as a sign of respect and alliance. Refusing to drink it could be seen as a political insult. Even conquest was framed around beer. The Spanish conquistadors were astonished by the ritual significance of indigenous beer. In many cases, the destruction of native temples included the dismantling of chicha breweries, less because they were functional and more because they were spiritual. To control a people, one had to control their rituals, and to control their rituals, one had to control their beer. But there is another angle to this history, one that's quieter, often overlooked. Brewing was one of the few domains in ancient life where women consistently held power. In Sumer, Egypt, pre-Roman Europe, Africa, and the Andes, women were the primary brewers, not just by coincidence, but by tradition. Brewing was seen as a domestic extension of baking, medicine, and hospitality realms historically overseen by women, and so beer became one of the earliest products of female-led industry. That began to change later, especially in classical antiquity, when brewing was increasingly commercialized and formalized. As brewing shifted from households to marketplaces, men took on more visible roles, and the sacred role of the female brewer began to fade, though in some regions it lingered far longer than the records suggest. Meanwhile, different cultures continued to innovate. In Northern Europe, brewers began adding herbs and spices to beer gruit, as it was called, to preserve and flavor their brew. These herbal mixtures gave rise to regional styles. Some were calming, others stimulating, and still others were mildly hallucinogenic. One could easily imagine a medieval Norse warrior drinking a mug of gruit-laced ale and believing he had heard the voice of a god. Even the method of serving beer had ritual weight. In many cultures, to drink from the same cup was a sign of trust. Toasting, or lifting one's drink toward the center of a gruit, is a practice that may date back thousands of years, perhaps to demonstrate that no one's drink was poisoned, or to create a symbolic unity before parting. So here, after thousands of years, beer had gone from accident to craft, from craft to culture, and from culture to power. It shaped taxes, worship, diplomacy, and gender roles. It soothed laborers and delighted kings. It touched nearly every civilization, and yet it never lost its rustic origin, the humble bubbling of wet grain left too long in a warm jar. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing. For all our advancements in brewing, our stainless steel tanks, our temperature controls, our designer yeast strains, the essential process remains the same. We still rely on the quiet, invisible work of fermentation. We still gather around glasses to mark moments both joyful and solemn. We still drink for courage, for comfort, for community. The world's oldest beverage, born of chance and necessity, still hums in the background of human life. But as you think of those ancient brewers, crouched in clay-walled kitchens or open-air courtyards, you might wonder, did they ever know they were shaping history? Did they understand that their bubbling pots would one day echo across thousands of years, in cultures they'd never imagined? Or did they just take another sip, wipe their hands on their apron, and get back to the mash, the world's first highway and the empire that needed it? You are standing in the dust of Western Asia in the 5th century BCE, under a sky so wide and dry it seems to hang motionless above the land. In front of you stretches a road, not a footpath or a trail, but a true, measured, maintained road. It's long, straight, and purposeful, lined at intervals by low stone markers. This is the royal road of the Achaemenid Empire, and with a royal permit in hand, you're allowed to walk it, but only just. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great and later expanded by Darius I, was vast, sprawling across modern-day Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and parts of India. To manage such an enormous patchwork of peoples, provinces, and problems, the empire needed more than soldiers or tribute. It needed information to flow quickly, reliably, and with the least number of camel-related delays. That meant infrastructure. That meant roads. The most famous of these was the Royal Road, a marvel of early engineering and administrative planning that connected Susa and modern Iran to Sardis and modern Turkey, running for about 1,500 miles. It was built with official use in mind, but it would come to carry couriers, merchants, diplomats, and the occasional noble with a flair for adventure or punishment. Now imagine yourself as a humble trader from Ecbatana. You secured a rare travel permit, likely from a local satrap, a governor of one of the empire's many regions. This document, possibly written on clay or thin parchment, bears an official seal, allowing you access to certain routes, station houses, and rations. Without it, the road would be closed to you. Even with it, travel is no free-for-all. You are part of an ancient bureaucratic system as tightly organized as any passport office today. You begin in Susa. The air smells faintly of clay, sweat, and the tannins of leather bags packed for the road. You pass under a low archway where the local registrar inspects your papers. He is not in a hurry. Few people in ancient administrative roles are. He studies your seal, squints at you, looks at your mule, and then nods grudgingly. You may proceed. The road is surprisingly well kept. Darius I wasn't interested in charming scenic detours, he wanted efficiency. So the Royal Road was built in straight segments, cutting across difficult terrain where necessary. It had bridges, drainage ditches, and mile markers at intervals of roughly 20 to 25 miles. There were relay stations known as piradazis, places where fresh horses, food, and occasionally guards could be found. The Persians didn't invent roads, but they did something better. They organized them. They stationed mounted couriers at these waypoints, part of a royal postal system called the Ingarium. Messages sealed with the king's insignia could travel from one end of the empire to the other in under 7 days, thanks to this rotating horse and rider system. Herodotus once marveled at this network, saying, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed." Sound familiar? The U.S. Postal Service would later adopt a version of it as their motto. But you, of course, are not a royal courier. You're a merchant, and a nervous one at that. Your permit allows use of the road. Yes, but not at royal speed. You travel slower, pausing at each station to check in, show your documents, and explain your purpose. A wrong answer could see your goods impounded or your passage denied. In some regions, the local satraps are known for their vigilance, borderline paranoia. They rule in the king's name, but they are kings in all but title. At the first station outside Susa, you stop for the night. The station is little more than a mud brick building with a low, flat roof. Inside, the air is cool and shaded, and an old man behind a reed screen records your name in a ledger, perhaps a clay tablet or a scroll of rough papyrus. You sleep on the ground, using your saddlebag as a pillow, listening to the distant sound of hooves and the mumble of other travelers. You've passed inspection, for now. Meals on the Royal Road are simple. You eat barley cakes, drink watered down wine or beer, and to dry dates or figs if you're lucky. There are no inns in the modern sense, no menus or private rooms. Travelers of different statuses sleep in different sections of the station, and those without permits are often turned away completely. The road may be long, but it is not open to all. Still, the efficiency is remarkable. When you're back on the road at dawn, you can tell this is not the meandering path of a caravan trail. This is a strategic artery, carefully designed to move goods, news, and soldiers quickly. Its existence meant that uprisings could be crushed before they spread. that satraps could be disciplined, and that the king could appear present even in the farthest reaches of his empire. Along the road, you pass immense columns with inscriptions in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, repeating royal edicts or declarations of power. Some travelers stop to rub their hands over the stone, perhaps as a kind of blessing or a reminder of who rules the land. The inscriptions make it clear: the king is aware, the king is everywhere, and the king made this road, even the gravel under your feet is, in some abstract way, part of his authority. But this road also connects cultures. At rest stops and station towns, you hear not only Persian, but Lydian, Aramaic, Egyptian, Greek. Traders bring spices, ceramics, textiles, and stories. You meet a man with amber from the Baltic and a woman who swears her olive oil is from a grove. Touched by Athena herself, languages blend. Weights and measures must be negotiated. The royal road, for all its order, is a place of constant exchange, and not all of it official still. The rules are clear. You sleep when allowed, walk when cleared, eat what you're given, and you keep your papers clean, dry, and close to your chest. Because while this might be a grand road, the Empire is always watching, and if you stray from your permitted path, there is no shortage of scribes and soldiers to remind you who built it. And so you continue, day after day. The dusting, your sandals deepens, the sunburn on your neck darkens. But each station brings you closer to your destination. Each checkpoint passed is a small act of trust in the sprawling, humming system of roads and rules. But as you trudge along, one thought lingers. If this was the easy way to travel in the ancient world, sealed, regulated, and patrolled, what was it like for those who weren't allowed? You're deeper into the Achaemenid heartland now, halfway between Susa and Sardis, and the novelty of the royal road has worn off. The road is still wide, the checkpoints still frequent, and the dust never less clingy. But now the journey has entered its true phase, the part travelers rarely talk about. When they brag over cups of wine, the long middle, the bureaucratic slog, the part where you're not quite near the beginning anymore, but nowhere close to the end dot at this point. The grandeur of imperial planning starts to blur into the dull rhythm of procedural repetition. The royal road was designed for continuity, and you feel it in your bones. Each Pyridazes or way station feels like a twin of the last. A central ledger room, a simple well, a cramped traveler's chamber, and the ever-present official who looks at your seal like it's the first and last thing he'll ever see. These station masters are not kings, but they might as well be, at least for a night. They control the food, the beds, the water, and most critically your next stamp of approval. That small smudge of ink or wax on your tablet or permit determines whether you can continue the next day. Sometimes, the station official is cheerful and slightly bored. Other times, he is severe and rule-bound. Once, you encounter one who insists on reading every line of your papers aloud, in a language you barely understand, while his assistant slowly nods beside him with theatrical solemnity. You are not sure if this is a ritual or a test or both. This is what Achaemenid administration was truly famous for: scale, but also standardization. Dryas' I's reforms didn't stop at roads. He had divided the empire into over 20 satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap who owed taxes and loyalty to the central royal court. And like any well-run machine, it required endless documentation. Orders were duplicated, translated into 3 or more languages, and dispatched through messengers on these same roads. And this is where the road becomes more than a physical path. It's a network of authority, silently humming with responsibility. The road isn't just for traders or even royal couriers. It's for the delivery of data, of empire itself. One missed message, one delayed courier, could mean rebellion, famine, or a tax failure in some distant province. That's why the bureaucracy never sleeps, even if you must. You pass through a territory near Arbella, where the landscape changes. Rolling plains are replaced with rockier soil. Here, The station is larger probably because this is near a satrap's secondary residence. There are guards this time, clad in scale armor, though they seem more interested in throwing dice than questioning you still. Your paperwork is examined twice. You overhear a scribe complaining about his stylus being stolen and a horse groom muttering about overdue oats. This may be the Persian Empire, but it runs on petty annoyances, just like everything else. You begin to notice small acts of resistance among travelers. Some merchants quietly bribe scribes to get earlier check-in times or cleaner rooms. A minor noble loudly demands wine from a region clearly out of reach, just to prove his station. A messenger in a dust-caked cloak whispers that he's carrying a report about a tax revolt to provinces over. You are too tired to care. The tax revolt involves more rest breaks. At one station, you meet a man who seems like he doesn't belong. He speaks softly and always seems to know what time it is, even without a shadow to measure. You eventually learn he is a royal surveyor, sent to inspect road conditions and report back to the central bureaucracy. He taps the stones with a hammer, measures the depth of wheel ruts with a bone tool, and takes notes in a language you don't recognize. The road is under constant review. The empire is watching itself. Even the local wildlife seems to respect the hierarchy. Birds nest only on certain rooftops. Dogs lie outside way stations and bark only when a foreigner approaches. Or perhaps that's coincidence. The road makes you believe in patterns that might not be there. Repetition does that. Once, as you pass a shallow river crossing, your mule hesitates. The water is not deep, but the animal smells something off. Rotting grain, perhaps. You dismount and let it drink anyway. At the other side, a small guard post demands your papers again. One of them has a bronze badge with the king's seal. You realize that he likely cannot read your document, but the seal is enough. Symbols do the work of literacy in this world. Later that day, you find yourself walking beside a Greek merchant who speaks a few words of Old Persian. He tells you stories of bribing Aegean officials with spiced wine, of accidentally trading goat hair for silver in Lydia, and of sleeping beside the body of a dead ox for warmth during a bad winter. You ask him what the worst part of the royal road is. He thinks for a long time, then says, "It makes you realize how organized power is. Even when no one is watching, you feel watched." At another station, just before dusk, a low whistle from a reed pipe floats through the courtyard. Someone is playing music gently, anonymously. It's not a performance. It's more like a prayer. No one claps, no one speaks. And when it stops, everyone pretends it didn't happen. Perhaps it did in single quotes. You continue west. Sardis is still weeks away. You've stopped counting stations. Because the pattern is so predictable, even surprises feel organized. You have memorized the bureaucratic phrases. Inspection has been completed. Seal confirmed. Permit valid through next station. You could probably staff one of these posts yourself now, but you can't shake the feeling that the road is not just a route, but a ritual. The same way religious pilgrims walk the same path to feel closer to the divine. You are walking a bureaucratic pilgrimage to the center of power. With every stamp and night of sleep on a stone floor, you're not just progressing in miles, you're participating in empire. And still, there's something odd. You keep noticing at some of the station's small notes, scratched lightly into the clay walls. They're in no formal script you recognize, just symbols, stars, arrows, waves, sometimes numbers, sometimes crude drawings of animals. No one mentions them. No one acknowledges their presence. But someone is leaving them. Who's marking the empire's walls with quiet symbols? And why do the station masters pretend not to see? The smell of sea salt reaches you before the city walls do. You've come far across arid plateaus, sun-baked valleys, and narrow mountain passes. Your papers are worn thin now, their edges soft. From overhandling, the once crisp seal now faint and smudged. You've memorized the administrative chants by heart. Show seal. declare cargo, state purpose. The ritual has changed you. You walk like a courier, sleep like a station master, and think like a man with something always waiting to be inspected. Now, after weeks on the royal road, Sardis rises before you, a city of pale limestone, thick, with traders and soldiers and chatter in half a dozen languages. This is where the road ends, or begins, depending on who you ask. The Ionian coast is not far now, and from their ships move faster than hoofbeats. But ships don't run on taxes, stamps, or gravel. They're less predictable, less Persian. As you enter the city, you pass through a final checkpoint. This one feels more relaxed urban, almost indifferent. The guard barely looks at your documents. Here, in a city teeming with unofficial traffic, your carefully preserved papers don't draw the same respect. It's unsettling. You've grown used to the certainty of authority. Now, in a place full of competing systems, Greek, Lydian, Aramaic, and Persian, there is no single voice of command. Just a layered murmur of markets, politics, and private negotiations. You sell most of your wares in the lower quarter: spice, barley, cakes, goat hides, a few ceramics that somehow survived the journey. A local merchant cheats you gently. You let him. He offers to trade your mule for a goat that eats less and sings more. You decline. Old habits are hard to let go, but something continues to nag at you, those symbols etched into the walls of way stations across the empire. The ones no scribe mentioned, no official acknowledged. At the final station outside Sardis, you had the chance to examine one more, a sequence of 3 stars, a wave, and a palm tree, scratched discreetly into the clay just above the water jar. That evening, as you dine beside a former courier now retired and half drunk on raisin wine, you ask about them. His answer is a shrug. Signs from the early days, maybe. He says, before the stamps, before the empire got so neat. Some say they mark the old trade lines, the pre-Persian paths. He leans in. Others say the signs are from smugglers or rebels or something older, but no one paints over them. Maybe we just forget why they were there. You think back on that, how the road connected everything: the cities, the provinces, the satraps, the messengers, the spies, and how it depended not on just stone and seal but on obedience. A shared belief in the road's rules. The signs didn't follow those rules. They lived alongside them, quietly. Before you leave Sardis, you visit a minor archive, really just a dusty set of scrolls, tied with twine behind a merchant shop. One document catches your eye. It's a fragment, written in Elamite, one of the empire's many administrative tongues. You don't read it, but the seal is unmistakable, the mark of Darius himself, pressed into hardened wax. And in the corner, almost unnoticed, someone has sketched a small triangle above a wave. You laugh, quietly. The empire runs on order, on permits, and on procedure. But even in its most controlled spaces, someone is still doodling in the margins. You leave Sardis not on a ship, but by foot again, turning north toward Lydia. No permit this time, just instinct. Your sandals are nearly worn through, but you walk like someone who understands roads now. How they're not just about reaching destinations, but about being measured, watched, and recorded. And even now, somewhere out there on the gravel, a courier is galloping east. A message is arriving in Susa before anyone can blink. The stations are alive, the seal bearers alert, the system humming. But what if one message never arrives? What if one satrap lies, or one station burns? What if a sign on a wall means more than a stamp permit? And what if the road so carefully maintained was never really about travel at all? Perfuming the gods, the daily rituals inside a temple courtyard. It's early, just after the second rooster's cry, and you're already walking through the pale morning haze that rises off the Nile's western bank. The air is still cool, though. It carries the familiar scent and earthy sweetness, like clay jars left to dry in the sun. You are a temple worker, an assistant to the pure ones, and today, like every day, begins with a ritual of cleansing and sending the gods. This isn't a myth or a festival. It's not a grand coronation or a day of pageantry. It's just Tuesday in the temple precinct of a provincial town, somewhere upriver from Thebes. The pharaoh is a distant symbol. The real gods here are statues, standing in dark, silent rooms, locked behind cedarwood doors, clothed in linens, their faces often hidden behind veils. And they must be woken, fed, bathed, and perfumed every single morning, whether they answer or not. You walk barefoot into the outer courtyard, the soles of your feet already hardened to the cool, smooth limestone, papyrus scrolls tucked into. Their reed cases line the small chapel's outer wall records of daily incense rations, tithes of barley, and allocations of sacred oil. Scribes with shaved heads are already at their stations, dipping rush pens into ink made of soot and water. Nothing moves here without a record. The scent hits you almost at once, myrrh, rich and resinous. Not overpowering, just enough to mingle with the ever-present undertone of burned acacia, which lingers from the morning's first offering fire. You could identify that scent with your eyes closed. It's what separates the temple from the rest of the world. It is, in a way, the boundary between mortal and divine space. Myrrh doesn't grow in Egypt. It comes from far to the south, from what later generations might call Somalia or Eritrea. It arrives in hardened tiers, irregular chunks wrapped in cloth, traded by caravan and boat, sometimes offered by distant kings as tribute. Each piece is precious. Each use is carefully measured. And yet, it is everywhere in the temple, mixed with oil to anoint statues, burned as incense, steeped into water to cleanse the altar stones. The ritual begins not with fire, but with silence. The priests, those with the privilege of entering the inner sanctum, undergo full-body washes, wear linens that have never touched the ground, and refrain from garlic, onions, or any strong-smelling food, you being one of the lower-ranked. Temple staff are not permitted to speak aloud within the sacred enclosure. Instead, you communicate in gestures pointing to basins, unrolling linens, offering trays of incense like a silent servant in a cosmic hotel. The god, in this case, is Ammon or perhaps Ta, depending on the district. You don't see him directly. Only the high priest has that right. You glimpse veils being drawn, gold glinting in the torchlight, and the faint sound of chanting in Middle Egyptian, a language already archaic even in your time. The god is treated not as an idea, but as a living sovereign. He is awakened, with clapping, bathed with scented water, dressed in layered linen robes, and finally anointed with myrrh oil, brushed gently onto his face, hands, and feet with a small reed wand. The process takes hours, and no step is ever skipped. Outside, in the lesser courtyard, visitors line up. Most are farmers or petty officials, bringing offerings of grain, dates, or carefully knotted cords to count debts. They do not enter. Instead, they pass their gifts to you or another intermediary, who stacks them at the offering table, where they will be recorded, weighed, and if considered worthy, ceremonially given to the god. In practice, they're redistributed. To the temple staff, you sometimes eat bread made with grain once blessed in a ritual. It's strange, but comforting. Holy leftovers. But the myrrh, that is never redistributed. That is the property of the god. Sometimes, you wonder why the gods require scent. They have no noses, no lungs, no way to inhale. And yet, it is known that the gods delight in smell. The oldest temple hymns say so. The scent of incense pleases him more than cattle. One scroll reads, another warns, woe to the priest who forgets the oil, for the god shall turn his face away. And so, every day, the scent of myrrh is renewed, some of it burned on small copper braziers, sending soft trails of smoke into the sanctuaries. Rafters, some of it mixed into cones of fat worn atop the heads of the officiants, slowly melting over time. Some of it soaked into reed mats placed beneath the statues, so the ground beneath the gods might smell sweeter than the Nile fields. You've seen what happens when the myrrh supply is late. A minor panic breaks out. Messengers are sent upriver. Scribes argue over the remaining inventory. Once, During a drought, the temple substituted juniper resin, but the chants were altered to acknowledge the difference. Even the gods must be told when their offerings change. In quiet moments between tasks, you lean against the cool sandstone and stare at the walls. They're covered in reliefs not just of gods, but of recipes. Yes, recipes. Ingredient lists for incense mixtures. Carvings of how to boil down frankincense with honey and mix it with date wine to produce a thicker scent. The walls of the temple are not just sacred, they are instructional. Your gods are fussy, and your ancestors knew it. By midday, the inner chamber is closed again. The statue is once more veiled. The braziers are left to smolder. Visitors have departed. The offering tables cleared. But the scent lingers, myrrh soaked into the porous limestone, clinging to linens, living in the air. You cannot scrub it away, nor would you dare try. The temple must always smell divine, or else the world might begin to rot from the inside out. You gather your tool stone bowls, clean copper ladles, the empty reed boxes, and return to the storage room. Already, a senior priest is reviewing tomorrow's incense schedule. Another is rechecking trade manifests to see if the next shipment of myrrh has cleared customs at Elephantine. The day ends, but the ritual does not. The gods sleep now, wrapped in oil and linen, veiled in fragrance. But you wonder, was it always myrrh? What did the earliest gods, the pre-dynastic ones, smell like before Punt was known? Did scent matter to them then, too? And what would happen if one day the scent stopped altogether? You may think of myrrh as a luxury good like gold or lapis lazuli, but in temple life, myrrh was necessity, not ornament. Behind its mystical associations lay a vast, invisible infrastructure: merchant fleets, long-distance caravans, scribes, tax collectors, and temple economists, all working to ensure the temples of Egypt never ran out of scent. The divine didn't just demand devotion, it demanded supply chains. To understand how myrrh came to be so central to Egypt's temple economy, you have to look southward, far beyond the cataracts of the Nile, to a place the Egyptians called Punt. No one today knows exactly where Punt was. The consensus drifts somewhere between modern Eritrea and coastal Somalia. But to the Egyptians of the 18th and 19th dynasties, Punt was not mythical, it was real, reachable, and filled with wonders, exotic trees, electrum, incense resins, and strange animals with long necks and spotted coats. The journey to Punt was no small errand. It involved carefully timed naval expeditions, often launched from ports near Thebes, sailing down the Red Sea with skilled pilots and crews familiar with the monsoon winds. The most famous expedition, recorded on the walls of Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, shows entire flotillas returning with myrrh trees in baskets, roots intact, soil included. Imagine it, an empire so determined to perfume its gods that it shipped living trees across the sea to try and plant its own scent farms. But the Egyptian climate was unkind to such dreams. Few of those trees survived, and so the temples remained, dependent on trade, and that meant management, careful planning, hoarded stores, and complex systems of barter. You wouldn't have seen myrrh being exchanged in a local village market. Instead, it passed through customs scribes, tax assessors, and temple treasuries, where it was logged with all the reverence given to sacred relics. Once inside the temple economy, myrrh was measured not in weight alone, but in ritual units. Some records mention cent days, the measurement not of substance, but of time. 1 cent day's worth of myrrh might be enough to anoint the statue of Ammon. During the morning rising, 5 cent days could cover the needs of a major festival, where dozens of deities received tribute in synchronized processions. The entire concept of divine time was perfumed literally, and it wasn't just myrrh. The sacred scents of Egypt formed an entire olfactory palette. Frankincense, also from Punt, was burned in morning offerings. Kyphi, a complex mixture of over a dozen ingredients including wine, raisins, honey, myrrh, and juniper, was reserved for evening rituals and was said to ease dreams and carry prayers to the afterlife. Cedar oil and cinnamon were used to wash temple floors and cleanse ritual vessels. Each had its purpose, season, and position in the daily schedule. In a way, the temples ran on scent the way palaces ran on grain or silver. You imagine a scribe's hand moving across a papyrus scroll, 2 rolls of linen, 12 cent days of myrrh, for jars of kifi to be delivered by moonrise before the festival of Osiris. These weren't poetic flourishes, they were practical instructions. Without them, the rituals would be incomplete, and in the eyes of Egyptian cosmology, an incomplete ritual risked disrupting the balance of Mat, the cosmic order. Even the act of transporting myrrh was treated with symbolic care. In festivals, resins were carried in gold-lipped alabaster jars or carved lapis vessels, wrapped in fresh linen, escorted by musicians and dancers. Offerings were often pre-scented oils brushed onto bread or bouquets of lotus dipped and perfumed. Water, the olfactory layer of a ritual, was not optional. It was the soul of the performance. Inside the temple kitchens, lesser-known workers would prepare the incense blends. Recipes were closely guarded, part religious secret, part practical tradition. These workers, though not high-ranking priests, were trained to recognize the quality of each resin by scent alone. Much like a vintner knows the ripeness of grapes, even a slightly off batch could be deemed unworthy. One mistake, and an entire shipment might be returned to storage, never burned, never offered. Interestingly, the use of myrrh extended even beyond the temple walls. In elite households, it marked social status. Wealthy guests at banquets often wore scented wax cones on their heads that melted slowly throughout the evening, releasing myrrh and other perfumes. In death, myrrh was applied during the mummification process, not just for preservation, but as a gift to the gods of the afterlife. Pharaohs and nobles were buried swathed in oils, drenched in fragrance. Even tomb inscriptions noted the scent. He smelled sweet in the afterlife, as a flower in the field of reeds. But it was in the temples that myrrh reached its fullest significance, a smell so bound to divinity that the scent itself became a kind of invisible offering, rising like smoke toward the rafters, never to return. And yet, beneath this entire sacred economy lay a sobering truth. The temples depended on fragile roots. A single missed shipment from Punt, a poor harvest in Nubia, a drought that slowed the river, any of these could break the chain. And the gods, despite their power, had no local substitutes for the perfumes they demanded. What happens to devotion when the perfume runs out, when the god must be woken, but the oil is gone? Do the priests improvise? Do the gods grow silent? You think of the jars lined up in the storeroom, each sealed with mud, stamped with a scribe's mark, each holding just enough sacred scent to appease the heavens for another day. The priests never speak of running out, but they always count. And you wonder, did the gods truly love the smell? Or did they merely grow used to it? The last rays of the afternoon sun slant through the high-slit windows of the sanctuary, casting dusty golden beams across the now quiet courtyard. The air still hums faintly, not with voices, but with a lingering memory of ritual scent. You smell it even now. The soft, woody bitterness of burned resin, the faint citrus tang of frankincense, the darker, heavier sweetness of myrrh that seems to cling to the very walls of the temple. But this moment is not timeless. In fact, time is slowly unraveling the world you know. The year is roughly 1200 BC, and while the temple continues its daily rhythm, rousing gods with clapping, dressing statues in pleated linens, and brushing their feet with oil-troubled brews, outside its limestone walls, trade is changing. Piracy along the Red Sea has grown bolder. The port cities once controlled by Egypt are slowly slipping away. The once predictable flow of incense and myrrh from Punt now arrives sporadically, and each missed shipment tightens the ritual schedule like a drying reed. You're still young, and your daily duties haven't changed much. Sweep the court, check the storeroom seals, prepare the offering trays. But you've noticed the elders whisper more. Temple scribes quietly reuse older scrolls, scraping away ink to write over old tallies. Some of the incense recipes are being simplified. The elaborate blends once reserved for festivals are now reserved only for coronations or royal births. In lesser ceremonies, juniper, acacia, and even native Egyptian herbs are substituted for imported myrrh. The air still smells rich, but something is missing beneath it. And with that absence comes a subtle shift. When a god is not properly perfumed, is he still truly present? The high priest insists he is. He reminds the priest that gods live in symbol and ritual, not in literal materials. But among the junior acolytes, questions bubble. If a ritual must be altered, does it still count? If myrrh was divine, what does it mean to replace it with dry lotus petals? Has the temple's relationship with the divine become more symbolic than actual? The elder priests do not entertain such questions. They adapt quietly. They invoke older texts that suggest scent is not just the substance, but the intention behind it. If the priest believes, the scent will reach the heavens. The gods, they say, can smell faith still. You remember your first festival as a child, when carts of myrrh arrived from Nubia, and the entire precinct was clouded in perfume. You remember the chorus of drums, the glint of gold-threaded banners, and the thick trails of incense curling into the blue morning sky. Even the floor stones seemed to breathe fragrance then, compared to that memory. Today's rituals feel quieter, more muted, like an echo of something grander. You're not alone in feeling it. Across the kingdom, the great temples of Karnak and Luxor begin consolidating incense stores, prioritizing the capitals over provincial sites. Some smaller temples close altogether, their sanctuaries sealed with resin and prayer, their last jars of scent locked away like relics. The scent of God becomes a rare and rationed thing, but this doesn't mean the temple dies. It simply evolves. Priests begin using metaphor more freely in their chants. Hymns emphasize the purity of light, voice, and intention rather than material. Offerings, some begin burning local woods, invoking older regional gods said to be satisfied with the smoke of cedar. The central dogma shifts ever so gently from pleasing the gods with materials to maintaining divine balance through remembrance. And there's something beautiful in that. The rituals may have begun with vast ships and gold-leaf vessels, but now, even a small reed basket of local herbs, offered with the correct words and postures, is said to be enough. The scent of myrrh becomes a memory, a thread to the past, a symbol of a time when gods walked more directly among the people. Eventually, even you rise in rank. You take over the record books, tally the resin rations, train a new assistant to recognize the color and texture of different oils. You teach him the old ways, the stories of Punt, the recipes carved into sandstone, the importance of the first scent of morning incense, and how it once marked the line between the sacred and the everyday. And one evening, you sit on the temple roof, the sun slipping behind the western hills, and ask yourself, was the scent for the gods or for us? Because even now, when the temple stores are low, and the recipes are simplified, and the perfumes arrive only every few seasons still, when the myrrh is burned, something changes. The air thickens, the walls seem to breathe, and for just a moment, you feel the presence of something older than stone or scrolls, something watching, something listening. Maybe that was the point all along.